Hello, and welcome back to another episode of BattleGUIDES. I hope you're ready because in this episode you face Iaxus, Elemental Lord of the Planar regions. Iaxus is a generalist type character who uses his amazing effects and incredible unique ability to control the battlefield. However, that does come at the cost of being generally poor in stats, having awkward ranges, and as well as being very susceptible to being card locked. Iaxus' unique ability is Planar Overlay. Iaxus has 5 plane cards and starts with 1 face-up on the board, active. Now, at the start of the anti-phase, as well as the first time Iaxus takes damage in a beat after all on-damage effects have applied, Iaxus' current plane gains a growth counter. Now, whenever a plane gets a growth counter, activate its growth effect immediately. However, if it were to gain its 5th growth counter, activate its collapse effect instead of the growth effect, removing all the growth counters on that card and collapsing that card. Now, after a plane has collapsed, it must be replaced by choosing a new plane from the remaining ones. If the opponent dealt damage to Iaxus and was the one who added the 5th growth counter to the plane, the opponent gets to pick the next plane. Otherwise, Iaxus gets to pick the next plane. At the end of any beat, if all of Iaxus' planes have collapsed, Iaxus loses immediately, getting eliminated from the game. It's very important to look at the planes themselves. Note, unlike many unique abilities that have you choose from one of so many things, I can't really give you guys a hierarchy this time because it really depends on 2 key factors. Number 1, your playstyle, and number 2, the current matchup you're in. If you're in any matchup with Iaxus, it's very important to know your opponent's strength and weaknesses, and the only way to get better at that is to play more games. So I highly suggest doing that if you want to get good with this character. Nevertheless, let's get on to the planes. First off, we have Tidal. Tidal is very interesting because it's one of the few planes that Iaxus has that doesn't directly benefit the opponent as well, as it only makes it so that Iaxus can move the nearest opponent 1 space upon gaining a growth counter. This is very great plus good, because Iaxus is able to use it as a form of hit confirm, effectively adding 1 range to nearly every of his attacks, all of his attacks. However, it's also good for making your opponent miss by pulling them away or towards you if they have minimum range. This is very versatile, allowing Iaxus to basically get dashes in where he couldn't or get attacks in where he couldn't. However, it is a double-edged sword because it's mandatory. Sometimes you don't want your opponent to move, but sometimes this will force you to do so. So be careful about that. Its collapse effect, on the other hand, is very impressive as well, allowing Iaxus to basically move anywhere on the board he wants. This is very good, especially if you're using an attack that does not have any range on it at all, or if you simply just want to dodge out of your opponent's way. Singularity has a growth effect that gives you and the opponent plus 0 to 1 range, effectively increasing both of your effective ranges. Now again, this is a double-edged sword because not only are you giving yourself more hit confirm, you're also giving opponents more hit confirm. Therefore, it's very important to be careful with this card as your opponent can get hits in on you even if you weren't expecting it. One good thing to remember is that if the opponent already has absurd amounts of hit confirm, this will barely benefit them at all. As another note, if you go second or if you're a reactive player, more often than not, you'll take damage before having to attack. And that means that you'll get a growth counter, which means that you'll get more range when you try to attack. So instead of having only 0 to 1, you'll have 0 to 2 extra range on your attack, which is monstrous, especially if your opponent forgot that you gain growth counters during the beat and not just during the anti-phase. Its collapse effect is actually pretty interesting as well, giving Iaxus range 1 to 8, regardless of what attack he plays. This is basically overkill because the farthest you ever need to go is 1 to 6, barring some characters that I will not mention until a later time. This basically makes all of your attacks full board range, and if you have enough stun guard or if you play certain styles with it, you basically can't be dodged, unless of course your opponent decides to dash. Infinity gives players power +1 as its growth effect, and this pretty much works the same way as Singularity does. Opponents that used to not hit so hard will now hit harder, and you'll hit harder as well. One thing to really note is, much like Singularity, if you get hit in the middle of the beat, you gain the extra +1 power while your opponent does not. This means that you're able to trade more positively if you go slower and have enough stun guard. Its collapse effect just basically gives Iaxus power +2 for each opponent in the game. Though, since in 1v1s that just means 1, Iaxus gains power +2, which is very, very good because it means that your opponent doesn't gain the power +1 because, again, the growth counters no longer apply. Well, the growth effects no longer apply. And this is very, very good for trading, especially against characters who have a lot of stun guard. Sealing makes it so that all players lose 1 life upon growth. And this could be similar to the Infinity Plane because it technically deals 1 point of extra damage. However, it does have this nuance wherein you don't have to hit the opponent to make use of it. This means that it's really great against opponents who like to zigzag and dash and move around the board a lot. You know, like speedsters. Speedsters hate this because basically no matter how much they try, hitting you will get them damaged as well. It's basically like thorns on armor. It's very interesting. You can use it for defensive plays, especially if you have a huge life lead, because as your opponent's life trickles down, it won't really matter so much for you because you still have a lot of HP. Its collapse effect is very interesting because it doesn't just make people lose more life. Instead, it makes Iaxus lose less. He has Soak 2 for each opponent for the rest of the beat. And again, in a 1v1, that would be Soak 2. This is very interesting because it basically negates most damage that tricksters and speedsters can do, because most of the time they'll only be dealing 2 damage. This basically gives Iaxus a free trade beat, allowing him to basically win the trade for free for 1 beat. So use it very, very well. Finally, we have Rifting. Rifting is insane. It makes it so that every time you gain a growth, you can reclaim a base or a style from your discard pile. Oh, I can't tell you how crazy matches get, especially if you start off with this plane, because it basically makes discards irrelevant, allowing you to gain nearly any card you've just recently played back into your hand, making it so that you and your opponent can become hyper aggressive. This plane is dangerous. You don't want to play this plane against an opponent who has amazing cards like Cadenza or Alexia. Instead, you want to play it against opponents who have really weak cards or cards that don't do varying things so that your prediction isn't hampered by it. Iaxus himself, though, has pretty amazing cards, all having some form of threat of power. This means that this plane, if you play it against an opponent who can't deal with Iaxus' options, oftentimes can win Iaxus the entire game if the opponent doesn't know what he's doing. The collapse effect is just great, allowing Iaxus to forcefully make his opponent discard cards. That basically makes your job easier because they have less ways of countering your stuff. This plane is dangerous and risky, but if you make it pay off, you will basically win the game. First off is Folding. Folding is a range style that has some great movement effects on it, and it really, and I mean really, works well with the Tidal Plane, allowing Iaxus to basically get whichever one of the 2 on-hit effects Folding has. It's very interesting and it's very, very powerful because it's not only a form of hit confirm, but it's also a way of allowing Iaxus to dodge opponents or ruin their day by giving them the worst positioning ever, especially if he does hit this at melee range. In light of that, I highly suggest pairing this attack with Grasp, so you go fast and you can almost guarantee its move anywhere effect. Or you can pair it with Drive, because Drive does similar things to Grasp, but instead of moving the opponent closer, you go towards the opponent. As an added bonus, that has insane hit confirm range as well. Diffuse is not only fast, but it's often used for its passive effect, which allows Iaxus to calculate range as if he were sitting off the edge of the farthest edge of the board. And that might sound complicated, but basically this is what you do. You look at Iaxus, pick which edge of the board is farthest away from him. Now imagine there's an imaginary space, and then imagine Iaxus is standing there when calculating range of your attack. This card is crazy, because it basically gives Iaxus multiple ways of getting hit confirms on opponents who think they're safe by hugging edges of the board farthest away from you. Iaxus will have none of that, and he will basically destroy you if you try to stay away from him. This card is very, very good in terms of hit confirm, even if Iaxus does have some iffy ranges sometimes. Do note that this goes very, very well with Tidal again, because it allows you to put them in the range that you want. Aside from that, the on-hit effect allows you to move the opponent around, but remember, it's mandatory, so you have to move them 2 spaces, which oftentimes means you'll have to move them closer to you. So be careful about that. One other nuance that I really like about this card is that you can influence which edge you're going to be calculating from by moving before that happens. So most of the time you can only do that by doing burst. So in light of that, I highly suggest you pair this attack with burst, as it allows Iaxus to influence which edge of the board he'll be calculating from, especially if he's in the center. Or if you want to feel very, very good about it, I highly suggest shots, because you can take advantage of the range bonus that you get. Remember, it calculates from the opposite edge of the board, which means that Iaxus' movements don't affect your range, so use that wisely. Seismic is slow and scary, and quite honestly, one of my personal favorite Iaxus cards. Iaxus has a very, very interesting interaction with this card, because it forces opponents to not move, because they might waste their gap closers in fear of Seismic's passive effect, which prevents them from advancing. The great dichotomy with this is the one with Diffuse, because Diffuse preys on your opponent not moving towards Iaxus, while Seismic preys on the opponents that do move towards Iaxus. This gives the opponent a binary choice, often making it a hard decision to make. Do I stay here and get hit by Diffuse, or do I move and run the risk of getting hit by Seismic? Either way, it'll be a poor trade for them, because they'll be wasting so much time thinking about it while you're just there playing cards willy-nilly. Because again, they're afraid of your cards, not the other way around. This also works very well with Tidal, allowing you to put opponents away without giving them the chance to come back towards you. In light of that, I highly suggest pairing this attack with his unique base plane step, because it gives him a lot of range, and plane step, well, hurts a lot and allows you to close the gap as well. And if you really want to be ballsy, you can do burst, because it basically counteracts drive, which is burst's natural counter, allowing you to retreat but not allowing them to advance to chase after you. It's effective and scary. Use it well. Exemplary has odd range, but it hurts. But it's also slow. However, that is remedied by the fact that this card carries Magical Stun Guard 3. Even if it is a combination of Soak and Stun Guard, the effective Stun Guard of this is 3+, which makes it very, very good when it comes to trading and playing safe attacks. The before activating effect does prove to be very interesting, because it basically gets you a free growth on that beat without it benefiting your opponent, because most of the time if you play this style, you'll be going second because it's freaking slow. This is very interesting with the Tidal Plane as well as the Infinity Plane. Actually, every single one of Iaxus' planes can heavily benefit this attack, because it'll either add more damage, add more range, or move the opponent into Iaxus' range. All of those together make this card very dangerous, potentially allowing Iaxus to deal +4 damage. One from the style, one from the anti-phase, one from getting hit, and one from the before activating effect. all of those will add up to make Iaxus deal monstrous amounts of damage. And if you consider the fact that this thing has Soak, Iaxus basically gets a free trade in whenever the heck he wants. In light of that, I highly suggest pairing this attack with Strike because it synergizes well with the Stun Guard. Or if you really want to hit opponents who are very far away, I can also recommend pairing this attack with Shot because Shot also has Stun Guard and the much needed range. Next up, we have Minimized. Minimized is one of my favorite Iaxus cards as well because it has a very interesting passive effect. If the opponent is within your attack's range, they lose 2 power and they can't stun you. Meaning that if they do try to hit you, Iaxus will temporarily gain stun immunity to whatever they do against you. This means that Iaxus can basically trade almost positively almost all the time, especially if the opponent is in the range of this attack. Actually, only if the opponent is in the range of this attack. Be careful of the minimum range though, because it basically means that Iaxus will not hit and the opponent won't be in your range because they're in minimum range. In light of that, pairing this with the Tidal Plane is just perfect because if the opponent does get near you, you can just push them away into your range and it will make it monstrous. However, if the opponent can't really advance as much, planes like the Infinity one, which gives you more power, is very good as well because again, your opponent has less power, giving you more leeway to give them more power, if that made any sense. In light of that, I highly suggest pairing this attack with Strike because it synergizes well with the minus power, effectively giving you Stun Guard 7. Also, if you want to really step up your game, pair it with Shot because, well, again, Shot has a lot of range and this attack is reliant on range. So, yeah.
Finally, we have Iaxus' unique base, Plane Step. Plane Step has
3 stats, and its passive effects are very interesting. Not only does range 1 always include Iaxus' attack's range, so that means that if the opponent's in melee range, Iaxus will always hit them. It also has this very interesting thing wherein its priority will always be 3, regardless of what styles you decide to pair with it. Which means that if you pair it with a slow style, it'll be faster. But if you pair it with a fast style, it'll be slower. It also has a great effect that allows Iaxus to teleport within any attack in his range. However, be careful because sometimes you don't want to teleport and you'll be forced to do so because it's a mandatory effect. Do note that in range only means the range going towards the opponent, not backwards, so you can't use it to dodge most of the time. This attack is very interesting and it synergizes well with Iaxus' cards that have minimum range because again, minimum range is bad. In light of that, I highly suggest pairing this attack with things like Minimized as well as Exemplary because it remedies the minimum range they have. However, if your opponent is at range 2 or 3, you won't hit because remember, Plane Step has 3 range and it's kinda awkward sometimes. Iaxus' 2 Overdrive Finishers are Zone Eater and Seize Control. Zone Eater is a mid-range Overdrive Finisher that basically preys on the fact that Iaxus has a lot of growth counters built up but hasn't collapsed his current plane because it gains +1 power for each growth counter that you can remove on your plane. And Iaxus gains life equal to that amount as well, making this basically a very positive trade in your favor. However, it all relies on the fact that you don't collapse your plane immediately, and it gets very dangerous, especially if the opponent's fast and he deals damage to you, collapsing the plane. So be very careful about that. If reliability, good range, and as well as some comeback potential is your thing, this is the Overdrive for you. However, if that's not your thing, maybe Seize Control is more of your thing. Seize Control is a long-range Overdrive Finisher that has amazing defense, but a very quirky effect because it only gains power the next time your plane collapses, which means that you can't rely on the anti-growth to collapse your plane. No, you have to make your opponent deal damage to you in order to gain power on this attack. And that's very hard to do considering that this thing has soak too. But it does make for a really good defensive attack, and if you're really about to lose, the end of beat effect allows you to reclaim your collapsed plane so that you don't immediately lose, especially if that's your last plane in existence. This Overdrive Finisher is very situational, but if you get it to work, it's way better than the first one. If big comebacks and amazing hype levels are your thing, this is the Overdrive for you. Now when it comes to using a special action, Iaxus is one of those characters who benefits a lot from all of them, really. Both of his overdrives are moderately okay. Cancel is very good because, like the brawler that he is, you want to get rid of your opponent's options. And Pulse is also good because Iaxus has a lot of ways to control the opponent's positioning. And if he can control that, he basically annoys the opponent to all heck. That way, the only real advice I can give is know your unique ability and your character well, and you'll do great with your special action. If you do want to know more about the special action, let's talk about that later on. Now let's move on to some Iaxus advanced strategies and combos. Iaxus advanced strategies are hard to talk about because this character is all about emergent gameplay and figuring out combos between his cards, and it's very interesting. Quite honestly, that might be why I love this character so much. Actually, I might like him better than Joel. This character is very interesting because a lot of his intricacies and nuances come out, especially if you played this game a lot. And I noticed that a lot of you wanted me to talk about Iaxus, and I'm guessing that's because you guys had no idea how to play him, and I don't blame you. I have a problem playing him sometimes because it gets complicated, especially with lack of experience when playing the character. So my number one tip for playing Iaxus is to literally play this game a lot. And a character that might be a good stepping stone towards Iaxus might be Joel, because he basically works similarly to Iaxus, having effects and combos that are emergent from his cards. But Joel's are easier to get because they're a little bit more in the card than Iaxus's is. Now, for dealing with Iaxus himself, I can really just give you a few things. When using Iaxus, remember to always manage your planes correctly. As much as possible, don't let the opponent collapse the plane, because you don't want them getting the plane that benefits them and not you. Stuff like speedsters getting the power plane when they want to, or maybe juggernauts getting the range plane when they want to. All of these together will make it very hard for Iaxus because the opponent is leveraging on your own unique ability, and you can't have that. So most of the time, if you're at around 3 or 4 counters in a beat, sometimes it's better to just dash and wait out the next beat for the collapse immediately. It does put a timer on Iaxus. Yes, it does. But most of the time, you won't lose to planar collapse because, mathematically speaking, you have 5 of those things, and then it takes 5 growths to destroy each. So that's 25 growth counters you have to gain. So that means in a span of 15 beats, you'll gain 15. So your opponent has to hit you 10 times in 15 beats to make it so that you lose via planar collapse. And that's still on beat 15. So for them to even beat you faster, they have to hit you a lot. And I mean a lot. Given that the average game length is 10 beats, you'll never lose to planar collapse. Almost never, ever. Unless it's like a multiplayer mode. But in a one-on-one, it barely even happens. However, that's something to be careful about, because you won't go through all your planes. Most of the time, you go through like 2 or 3 of them before dying or killing your opponent. So that means that you have to be careful with your plane selection, because you can't hold off on the best planes for last because you'll never get there. So be careful. Play your planes properly. Play them at the opportune times. You don't want to be playing the range plane if you're in melee range. It makes no sense. So be careful about your planes and think a beat ahead. Iaxus is a kind of escalation character as well, so that means that it's not always about winning the current beat. Sometimes it's about tempo plays. Much like Arik, you have to gain resources in order to regroup your cards, get better cards, or maybe, wait for a collapse or wait for a new plane. All of these factors make highly incentivize Iaxus to wait it out a few beats, because sometimes you just have to wait. Patience rewards, right? Patience rewards the patient. First up is Folding Drive. Folding Drive might not seem that good, but it's very, very, very good if you do make it work. It's not that fast and it doesn't have a lot of stun guard, but it's very great against opponents who are either slow or middlers who decided to be slow this beat. It allows you to control the board, and that's what Iaxus is good at. Put them far away from you and then watch them fear, seismic, and diffuse at the same time. Next up is Seismic Burst. Seismic Burst is a no-brainer. Actually, if you figure this attack out, it's very, very fun. Very, very good, too. It basically makes it so that Iaxus is nearly indomitable in melee range, because he will dodge your attack and then he will smack you in the face. Do be careful against your opponents' shots though, because they'll be faster than this attack. And finally, we have Minimized Strike. Minimized Strike basically is the ultimate trading attack. You are able to basically whack your opponent for 4 damage while they whack you for 2 less damage than they should. Mix that in with Stun Guard 5 and the plus range and you have a free win. Pair that, however, with a variety of your planes and it'll just be monstrous. That goes actually for every single one of Iaxus' attacks. Most of them, if not all, benefit in some way, shape, or form from a growth or collapse effect. However, I won't go over every single one of them because again, that'll take too long. Just know that there is an interaction there somewhere and you'll figure it out. And quite honestly, that's the fun of this character. So I'll leave that to most of you to figure out. I've given you some, but you guys can handle the rest. You guys are smart enough. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Battle Guides. I'm so sorry it came a little bit late. I was busy writing scripts for the prize videos. Now, since I've written the scripts, I can finally announce what they are. Basically, there'll be 2 new episodes of Battle Tips. Wow, I never knew that would be revived. One episode will be about the ever famous special action. I keep telling you guys not to forget, but I've never told you how to use it properly. So that'll be an entire video dedicated to that. The other video, on the other hand, is very, very interesting as well because it'll be about the BattleCON Armory, a variant to the original BattleCON game that allows you to get equipment and equip your characters and make custom characters. It's very interesting and a very fun play mode, and I'll talk about some of the nuances as well as some of the general tips when playing that variant, especially giving you guys tips on how to build your characters effectively. Aside from that, I thank you all so much for watching, and remember, don't forget your special action, and thank you, World of Indines. Thank you, and good night!